The stadium lights went dark for exactly 7 seconds, and in those 7 seconds, one teenager noticed something that no one else did. The roar of 80,000 fans inside the FIFA World Cup final suddenly disappeared into an uneasy silence as the giant screens froze, the match clock stopped, and every official in the control room stared at the same impossible error message. Near the edge of the technical tunnel, 17-year-old Jalen Brooks stood still, holding a small maintenance notebook in his hands. His eyes were not on the broken screens. They were fixed on a tiny green light blinking beneath a locked panel that was supposed to have no power. Jalen slowly stepped closer, his fingers tightening around the notebook. He had seen that signal before. But before he could touch the panel, a security officer shouted across the hallway, stopping him in front of dozens of people. The cameras turned, the staff turned, and suddenly, the quiet volunteer became the center of attention. No one understood why a teenager in a simple FIFA event jacket looked more worried than the engineers who built the system. No one knew why he kept looking at a panel that was not even listed on the official stadium map. And no one knew who had activated it. Earlier that morning, Jalen had walked through the same stadium carrying equipment boxes and checking connection points that most people ignored. While others rushed to prepare the biggest soccer match in the world, he paused at small details. A cable that looked newer than the others, a sensor that responded half a second too late, and a warning light that disappeared whenever someone walked near it. He was only a volunteer. He was not an engineer. He was not a manager. He did not have a private office or a name that opened doors. But he noticed things because he believed every detail mattered. Inside the VIP operations room, Richard Hawthorne watched the final preparations from behind a wall of glass screens. The 56-year-old billionaire had built his reputation on perfect systems and flawless execution. Around him, his team promised everything was ready. The technology had been tested. The security protocols were active. Nothing could go wrong. But deep inside the stadium, something had already started moving. Jalen returned to the tunnel and looked again at the strange panel. A small electronic tag was attached beneath it, covered with markings he did not recognize. He reached for his phone to record it, but the screen showed a message he had never seen before: access restricted. At that exact moment, every camera in the tunnel flickered, the hallway lights dimmed, and for 90 seconds, the entire security system stopped recording. When the cameras came back online, the mysterious panel was still there, but the strange electronic tag was gone. Jalen looked down at his notebook, then toward the crowded stadium where millions of people were waiting for the final to begin. He knew something was wrong, and before he could tell anyone, the first official announcement came over the stadium speakers. The match would begin as scheduled. But hidden beneath the noise of the crowd, a silent countdown had already started. The announcement echoed through the stadium, but Jalen Brooks could barely hear it over the sound of his own thoughts. The countdown he had noticed was not on any official screen. It was hidden somewhere deeper, somewhere only a person who understood the old maintenance systems would recognize. He looked around the tunnel, searching for the missing tag that had vanished from the panel. Someone had removed it quickly. Someone who knew he had found it. Jalen slipped his notebook into his jacket and walked toward the operations area, but every step felt heavier. The moment he entered the hallway, 2 security officers moved toward him. Their expressions had changed. They were no longer seeing him as a volunteer helping with the event. They were seeing him as a problem. "Why were you near restricted equipment?" one officer asked. Jalen opened his mouth to answer, but before he could explain, a staff member pointed at the camera footage. The screen showed Jalen standing beside the panel alone. It looked suspicious. It looked like proof. What nobody saw was the missing 90 seconds before that moment. What nobody knew was what happened while the cameras were blind. Across the stadium, Richard Hawthorne watched the situation unfold from the control room. The billionaire had spent decades building systems that depended on trust, precision, and accountability. He did not like uncertainty, especially during the most important match in the world. His executives quickly gave him an explanation. They said the volunteer had accessed equipment he was not authorized to touch. They said the outage was probably caused by a mistake. They said there was no reason to investigate further. Richard stared at the frozen image of Jalen on the screen. The teenager looked nervous, but not guilty. That small difference bothered him. Still, with the final moments before kickoff approaching, Richard made a decision. "Remove him from the technical area until we know what happened," he ordered. The words traveled through the stadium faster than Jalen expected. Within minutes, the same people who had watched him carry boxes and repair loose connections now avoided his eyes. Jalen stood beside the service corridor, holding his old notebook while the crowd outside celebrated the beginning of the final. Then something unexpected happened. A young technician secretly approached him and looked around before speaking. "You were right about the system," the technician whispered. Jalen looked up. The technician showed him a small piece of equipment hidden inside a maintenance bag. It was the missing electronic tag from the panel. "I found this near the control room," he said, "but I do not know who removed it." Before Jalen could ask another question, the technician received a message on his phone and immediately walked away. Jalen watched him disappear into the crowd of workers. Then his own phone vibrated. A file had appeared without a sender. It contained a single image from inside the stadium network. Jalen opened it and froze. The image showed a hidden access route connected to the emergency systems. And at the bottom of the file was one name he never expected to see: Richard Hawthorne. The name on the hidden file made Jalen Brooks stop breathing for a moment. Richard Hawthorne, the same billionaire whose company controlled the technology running the biggest soccer match on Earth. The same man who had just ordered him away from the control area. Jalen stared at the screen, waiting for another line to appear, another clue that would explain why his name was connected to a secret access route. But the file disappeared before he could save it. The message window went blank, leaving only a single question behind. Why was Richard Hawthorne connected to the hidden system? Jalen quickly opened his notebook and began comparing the image with the diagrams he had studied during his volunteer training. The emergency route was real. It was an older backup network, one that should have been removed years ago. Someone had not only restored it, but hidden it beneath the modern system. Before he could finish tracing the connection, a voice interrupted him. "You should not be looking at that." Jalen turned and saw Marcus Vale, the senior technical director responsible for the stadium operations. Marcus stood calmly, but his eyes moved toward the notebook in Jalen's hands. "Give me that," Marcus said. Jalen stepped back. For the first time that day, he realized the problem was bigger than a broken system. Someone was afraid of what he had discovered. Meanwhile, Richard stood inside the main control room, watching engineers rush between screens. The match had started, but small failures continued appearing. The timing system delayed by fractions of a second. Communication signals dropped unexpectedly. The problems were too small for the crowd to notice, but too unusual for Richard to ignore. He walked toward the technical display and noticed something strange. Every failure was happening near the same hidden network location. "Who authorized the emergency route?" Richard asked. The room became quiet. The engineers looked at each other. No one answered. That silence told him more than any report could. Richard opened the security logs himself and searched for the access history. The records showed something impossible. The hidden system had been activated before the match began. Then the screen revealed the user identification: Jalen Brooks. Richard looked toward the hallway where the teenager had been removed. For the first time, he questioned the story everyone had given him. A few minutes later, Jalen found himself back in the service corridor, still trying to understand what was happening. He looked through the old system notes and noticed a small symbol beside the emergency route. It was not a company mark. It was a symbol from a youth training program he had joined years earlier, a program that taught students how stadium technology worked behind the scenes. Someone had deliberately hidden a system that only a few trained people would recognize. Then Jalen noticed something else. The activation time on the file matched a moment when he was standing in front of hundreds of people, nowhere near the control room. His hands went cold. Someone had used his identity. Before he could process it, every screen in the service corridor suddenly turned black. A message appeared across all displays: "System recovery required." Beneath it was a countdown. And this time, everyone in the stadium could see it. The countdown on every screen changed the atmosphere inside the stadium instantly. The crowd still cheered, unaware that beneath the celebration, the technology controlling the final was slowly slipping away. In the service corridor, Jalen Brooks watched the numbers fall and felt the same warning he had seen earlier. This was not a random failure. Someone had planned it. Before he could move, security personnel appeared at both ends of the hallway. The order had already been given. Jalen was no longer allowed near any technical equipment. "You need to come with us," one officer said. Jalen looked at the countdown, then at the locked access doors around him. He knew if he left now, whoever created this problem would have exactly what they wanted. But arguing would only make him look more suspicious. He lowered his notebook and quietly followed them. Inside the main control room, Richard Hawthorne watched the situation unfold through dozens of screens. The engineers continued blaming the volunteer, showing the access logs that carried Jalen's identification. "The evidence is clear," Marcus Vale said. He triggered the emergency route. Richard did not answer immediately. He looked closer at the timeline. The activation happened before Jalen ever reached the panel. The numbers did not match the story. For the first time, Richard noticed something everyone else had ignored. The system was not reacting to Jalen's actions. It was reacting to someone using Jalen's identity. Richard walked toward the security terminal and searched deeper into the records. A hidden file appeared, then disappeared almost instantly. But for 1 second, he saw enough. The file contained a list of unauthorized access attempts from the previous month. Every attempt was connected to the same internal department. The department controlled by Marcus Vale. Richard turned around, but Marcus was already watching him. Neither man spoke. The silence between them carried more weight than any accusation. Meanwhile, Jalen was taken to a quiet holding area near the stadium offices. He sat alone with his notebook on the table, replaying every moment. The strange panel, the missing tag, the fake access record. Then he remembered something from his old training program. Emergency systems were never designed to be activated remotely. They required a physical confirmation from someone standing near the equipment. Someone had not just copied his identity. Someone had built the entire situation around, making him look guilty. A small detail in his notebook caught his attention. Beside the old emergency route symbol, he had written a note years earlier during training. "The backup system remembers every person who touches it." Jalen immediately stood up. If the system remembered physical contact, there had to be proof hidden somewhere. At that exact moment, Richard entered the room. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The billionaire who had ordered him away now stood in front of him, holding the same evidence that could clear his name. "Tell me everything you saw before the cameras went dark," Richard said. Jalen looked at him carefully, unsure whether this was another test. Then the stadium lights flickered again. A new message appeared across every screen outside. "Manual reset required." And below it, one final line appeared. "Authorized user, Jalen Brooks." Richard Hawthorne looked at the message on the screen, then slowly turned his eyes toward Jalen Brooks. For the first time since the failure began, the billionaire was not looking at a suspected problem. He was looking at the only person who might know how to stop it. Jalen stepped closer to the terminal, but he did not touch anything yet. "That system is using my identification," he said quietly. "But I did not activate it." Richard studied his face, searching for hesitation, fear, or a hidden motive. Instead, he saw something different. He saw someone who had been trying to warn them from the beginning. Together, they returned to the technical corridor where the emergency panel was located. The stadium around them continued moving toward chaos. Fans watched the match. Players waited for updates. Officials demanded answers. But behind the walls, the real battle was happening between people trying to expose the truth and people trying to hide it. Jalen connected a temporary diagnostic tool to the old system. The screen filled with lines of data, showing every interaction with the emergency network. Richard watched silently as the records appeared. Then Jalen stopped. There was a timestamp that changed everything. The first unauthorized access happened 3 weeks before the final. The user profile attached to it was not Jalen's. It belonged to a senior executive account. Richard leaned closer. "Whose account?" he asked. Jalen looked at the screen. The answer appeared slowly. It was connected to a department under Marcus Vale's authority. But before either of them could react, the file automatically locked itself. Someone had built a protection system around the evidence. Someone expected them to find it. Richard removed his access card and tried to override the lock, but the system rejected him. The billionaire who could open almost any door suddenly found himself powerless in front of a machine designed to ignore him. Jalen noticed something unusual. He looked at the old interface, then at the small notes written beside the controls. "This system was not built for executives," he said. "It was built for people who actually maintain the stadium." Richard looked at him. "What are you saying?" Jalen pointed toward the hidden options. The backup network had a second verification method. It did not trust titles, money, or authority. It trusted knowledge. For the first time, Richard understood why Jalen had been targeted. The teenager was not chosen because he was weak. He was chosen because nobody would believe him. A message suddenly appeared on the terminal. A video file had been recovered from the missing camera footage. Richard opened it, expecting to see proof against Jalen. Instead, the screen showed a different scene. It showed Marcus Vale entering the restricted area before the system failure began. In his hand was the same electronic tag that had disappeared. Jalen and Richard watched the footage in silence. But then the video stopped before revealing what Marcus did next. Only one frame remained frozen. Marcus standing beside the emergency panel. And behind him, reflected in the glass, was another person watching everything happen. The frozen image on the screen stayed there like a warning no one wanted to see. Marcus Vale stood beside the emergency panel, holding the missing electronic tag in his hand. Behind him, hidden in the reflection of the glass, was another figure watching the entire operation. Richard Hawthorne leaned closer, trying to identify the person in the reflection, but the footage suddenly distorted and shut down. The evidence was gone again. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the stadium systems struggling to survive. Then every screen changed. A new alert appeared across the control room. Manual override failed. System lockdown initiated. The final was no longer just delayed. The entire technology network was entering a complete shutdown sequence. Richard looked at Jalen. "Can you stop it?" Jalen stared at the countdown. The answer was written across his face before he spoke. "I can try. But whoever created this knew someone would come here." They rushed back to the emergency panel, but the system that had once responded to Jalen now rejected every command. The old network had changed. Someone had removed the one thing that allowed a manual recovery. The same system Jalen had discovered was now being used against them. Outside the control room, the situation became worse. Officials announced that the technical issue was causing delays, and cameras began searching for someone responsible. Within minutes, a message spread among the staff. The volunteer who had accessed restricted equipment was under investigation. Jalen heard people whispering as he walked through the corridor with Richard. The same people who ignored him earlier now looked at him with suspicion. Richard noticed it too. For years, he had been surrounded by people who trusted his name. Now he watched a teenager experience what happened when nobody trusted yours. A security team approached them with new information. They had found another access record. This time it was worse. The system showed Jalen's identification attached to a command that could permanently erase the emergency network. The room became silent. Even Richard looked uncertain for a moment. Jalen stepped back, shocked. Someone had not only copied his identity. Someone was preparing to make him responsible for destroying the evidence. Richard looked at the screen, then at Jalen. "If this goes public before we prove the truth, everyone will believe this was you." Jalen lowered his eyes toward his notebook. He had one choice. He could walk away and protect himself, or he could stay and risk everything to stop a disaster he did not create. Before he could answer, the stadium lights flickered again. The countdown reached its final minute. Then every screen displayed a new message. "Emergency reset requires original authorized user." The control room doors locked automatically. The system searched the building. A single name appeared, Jalen Brooks. And beneath it, a second message appeared that made Richard's expression change completely. "Original user location confirmed, inside the stadium." The name on the screen was impossible. Jalen Brooks stared at it while the countdown continued falling, each second bringing the stadium closer to a complete shutdown. The system claimed he was the original authorized user. But Jalen had never been inside that control network before. At least, that was what he believed. Richard Hawthorne watched him carefully, waiting for an explanation, but Jalen had none to give. Then he noticed something hidden beneath the message. A small symbol appeared beside his name. Not a company mark, not a security code. A symbol from the youth technology program he had joined years earlier. The same symbol he had seen on the old emergency route. Jalen moved closer to the screen. "This system remembers people," he whispered. Richard looked confused. "What does that mean?" Jalen opened his notebook and searched through old training notes he had carried for years. Near the back page was a faded diagram from his first stadium technology workshop. It showed a backup system designed decades earlier. The original purpose was not automation. It was human verification. The system was built to recognize the people who understood it, not the people who owned it. Richard looked at the countdown again. Then he looked at Jalen differently. The teenager was not connected to the system because he had broken it. He was connected because someone had used his knowledge as a key. Before they could investigate further, the control room doors opened. Marcus Vale walked in with several executives behind him. His expression was calm, almost too calm. "Richard, this has gone far enough," Marcus said. "The volunteer caused the failure. We need to protect the event." But Richard did not move aside. For the first time, he questioned the people standing closest to him. "Then explain why your department accessed the emergency network 3 weeks ago." Marcus's expression changed for only a second, but it was enough. Jalen noticed it. Richard noticed it too. The room became silent. Then Marcus revealed the piece of information that changed everything. "You think this system belongs to the company," Marcus said. "It does not. It belonged to someone else before the company bought this stadium." Richard frowned. Jalen looked at the screen. The hidden network was not a new security risk. It was an old safety system that had been buried after the stadium changed ownership. Someone had removed it because it gave too much control to the people who maintained the building instead of the executives who managed it. Jalen suddenly understood why the system chose him. Years earlier, during a youth training event, he had helped test that exact emergency network. His name was stored because he was one of the students who proved they understood how to keep it alive. But before they could recover the system, Marcus activated a final command. Every screen turned red. The emergency network began deleting itself. Richard stepped forward, but the system rejected his authority. Jalen looked at the disappearing data and realized the truth. The only person who could save the evidence was the same person everyone believed had caused the problem. He reached toward the control panel. Then the lights across the stadium went completely dark. The stadium went silent as the last emergency lights faded away. For a few seconds, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Jalen Brooks stood in front of the old control panel, surrounded by darkness, while Richard Hawthorne watched the teenager prepare to do what no executive, engineer, or system administrator could do. The screen flashed one final warning. "Data purge in progress." Jalen placed his hand near the panel, but he stopped before touching it. He remembered the training. The system was never controlled by force. It was controlled by understanding. He opened his old notebook and found the faded diagram from years ago. There was one small note written in the corner by one of his instructors. "The person who protects the system is the person who knows why it exists." Jalen entered the recovery sequence carefully. The screen changed. Instead of asking for a company authorization, it asked a simple question. Identify the original purpose of the emergency network. Jalen typed the answer. Not security. Not control. Protection. The system paused. Then the hidden files began returning one by one. Richard watched as years of missing records appeared on the screen. Maintenance reports. Access attempts. Internal communications. Evidence that had been hidden beneath layers of corporate data. For the first time, the truth was no longer something people had to believe. It was something they could see. Richard moved closer to the screen. Among the recovered files was a complete timeline showing how Marcus Vale's department had slowly replaced the original safety systems with a private access network. The goal was not to improve the stadium. It was to create a system that only a few powerful people could control. Jalen looked at Richard. "They did not break the system," he said. "They changed who the system was built to protect." Those words stayed with Richard. He looked around the room at the executives who had trusted reports more than people. Then he made a decision. Richard disconnected his own access card from the control network. "Record everything," he told the security team. "No one deletes another file." Marcus stepped forward, trying to stop the process. But this time, nobody moved with him. The same employees who had ignored Jalen earlier now watched the evidence appear in front of them. The story they believed was falling apart. The volunteer they blamed was the person saving the event. But before the system could fully recover, one final encrypted file appeared. Richard opened it carefully. It was not from Marcus's department. It was from someone who had been watching the entire operation from the beginning. The file contained a single image from the first night the hidden system was activated. Jalen leaned closer. The person standing beside Marcus in the reflection was finally visible. It was someone Richard recognized immediately. Someone inside his own company. The recovery reached 99%. The stadium lights began returning one section at a time. The crowd outside erupted as the screens came back online. But inside the control room, nobody celebrated yet. Because the truth they had uncovered was bigger than one person's mistake. And the final name in the hidden file was still waiting to be revealed. The final encrypted file remained open on the screen, waiting for the last piece of truth to appear. Richard Hawthorne stood silently beside Jalen Brooks, watching the names slowly load beneath the recovered records. For years, Richard had believed the greatest threats came from outside his company. Now the evidence showed something much closer. The person who helped hide the truth was Daniel Mercer, the former operations strategist who had designed the private access system without approval. Daniel had used Marcus Vail's department as a cover, creating a network that gave a small group control over the stadium's most important technology. Marcus had followed the plan because he believed protecting the system meant protecting his own position. But the evidence revealed something neither man expected. The original emergency network was never a weakness. It was created to make sure no single person could control everything. Jalen's knowledge had not given him power. It had given him responsibility. Richard looked at the teenager standing beside him, remembering the moment he had first seen him as only a volunteer near restricted equipment. Now he saw the person who had noticed what everyone else ignored. Security teams moved through the control center as the recovered files were transferred to independent investigators. Marcus lowered his eyes as the truth became impossible to deny. The people who had questioned Jalen earlier now stepped aside and allowed him to finish the recovery process. The final command appeared on the screen. Manual restoration complete. Across the stadium, the lights returned. The giant screens came back to life. The match officials received confirmation that the technology was stable again. Outside, thousands of fans celebrated without knowing how close everything had come to disappearing. Inside the control room, Richard removed his executive badge and placed it beside the old maintenance panel. Then he turned toward Jalen. "You were the only person who kept looking when everyone else stopped." Jalen looked down at the small notebook he had carried throughout the entire night. The pages were worn. The handwriting was uneven. But every observation, every warning, and every detail had mattered. A few weeks later, the stadium opened a new youth technology program for students interested in engineering and maintenance. Richard personally announced that the first student advisor would be Jalen Brooks. But Jalen did not stand on the stage because he had become powerful. He stood there because someone finally listened. The old emergency panel was placed inside the stadium's technology center, not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder of the people who quietly protect what others depend on. Richard changed the way his company reviewed problems. Reports from employees at every level were given attention, not just those with important titles. He no longer measured trust by position. He measured it by dedication. Months later, during another match at the same stadium, Jalen walked through the technical tunnel carrying a new notebook. The same place where he had once been stopped was now where young students followed him, asking questions and learning from his experience. He paused near the old panel and looked at the small green light glowing beneath the glass. This time, it was not a warning. It was a sign that the system was still watching, still protecting, and still remembering the person who cared enough to notice when the world looked away.